We often ask a dangerous question: what is wrong with the world? We point to corruption, violence, ignorance, broken systems, broken people. We blame governments, societies, generations, ideologies. But very few dare to ask the more uncomfortable question: what is wrong within me? Because the truth is this: the world is not only out there, the world is also within us. Every conflict you see outside mirrors a conflict unresolved inside. Every injustice is born first in the human psyche. And every meaningful transformation of society begins with a transformation of the individual. If you truly want to make the world a better place, the path does not start with changing others. It starts with facing yourself. Let me show you how. Every human being carries within himself a hidden companion, a presence that walks beside him throughout life yet is rarely acknowledged. This presence is not foreign, nor is it imposed from the outside. It is born from the same psyche that gives rise to love, creativity, and hope. It is the accumulation of everything we have learned to reject about ourselves. Anger we were told was unacceptable. Envy we were taught to feel ashamed of. Greed we disguised as ambition. Cruelty we buried beneath politeness. Fear we silenced by pretending to be strong. These rejected qualities do not vanish simply because we disapprove of them. They retreat into the unconscious, where they wait, unseen but active, shaping our thoughts, decisions, and reactions. We prefer to believe that those who commit harm are fundamentally different from us. We draw a psychological line between good people and bad people, placing ourselves safely on the side of virtue. This belief is comforting, but it is also dangerously naive. History repeatedly shows that the most devastating acts are not committed by monsters who recognize themselves as such, but by ordinary individuals who were convinced of their own righteousness. They were fathers, neighbors, professionals, citizens. They loved their families, followed routines, and believed themselves morally justified. What made them dangerous was not their awareness of darkness, but their denial of it. When a person is unable to see his own capacity for harm, he begins to project it outward. The aggression he cannot accept within himself is suddenly discovered in others. The greed he denies becomes visible everywhere else. The cruelty he refuses to acknowledge appears to dominate the world. And once projected, it becomes easy to justify hatred, punishment, and violence. I am not the problem, the psyche whispers. They are. In this way, the unexamined shadow becomes the invisible architect of conflict. Consider how often moral certainty has preceded destruction. Wars have been fought not by those who thought themselves evil, but by those who believed they were saving civilization, defending truth, or protecting the innocent. The most terrifying phrase ever spoken is not, "I want to destroy," but "I am right." When a person believes himself purely good, he grants himself permission to do terrible things in the name of that goodness. His conscience no longer restrains him, because he has convinced himself that he has none of the darkness he is unleashing. The shadow does not demand indulgence, but recognition. Denying it does not make us virtuous, it makes us unconscious. What we refuse to see within ourselves gains autonomy. It begins to act through us in moments of stress, anger, fear, and exhaustion. We say things we do not recognize. We act in ways that surprise us. Later, we ask, "Why did I do that?" The answer is simple. Though uncomfortable, a part of you that you refuse to know took control. Yet when a person dares to turn inward with honesty, something remarkable occurs. The shadow, once feared, begins to lose its grip. Awareness introduces responsibility. When you can say without self-deception, "I am capable of anger, envy, cruelty, and harm," you are no longer possessed by those forces. You are now in relationship with them. And relationship allows choice. This is not a call to self-condemnation. It is a call to psychological maturity. To know that you are capable of harm does not mean you are destined to cause it. In fact, it is precisely this knowledge that makes restraint possible. The person who knows his own aggression can channel it into courage, assertiveness, and protection. The person who acknowledges envy can transform it into motivation and self-understanding. The person who recognizes his fear can develop humility and empathy. We often misunderstand goodness as the absence of darkness. In truth, goodness is the result of integrating darkness. It is forged, not assumed. A truly moral individual is not one who claims purity, but one who has confronted his capacity for destruction and chosen responsibility instead. Such a person does not need enemies to define himself, nor does he need moral superiority to feel secure. He is grounded because he is whole. In everyday life, the shadow reveals itself in subtle ways. It appears in the irritation you feel toward a colleague whose confidence unsettles you. It speaks through the harsh judgment you pass on someone whose flaws resemble your own. It emerges in the pleasure taken in another's failure, even when you would never admit it aloud. These moments are invitations, not accusations. They are opportunities to ask, what part of me is speaking right now? Most people ignore this question. A few listen. Those few grow. When the shadow is ignored, it leaks into relationships. It becomes passive aggression, manipulation, dishonesty, and resentment. We wound others without understanding why. We repeat patterns we swore we would never repeat. We become the very thing we despise, all while insisting that we are nothing like it. But when the shadow is acknowledged, relationships change. There is more patience, because you recognize your own flaws. There is more compassion, because you know how easily you could stand in another's place. There is less need to dominate, control, or prove moral worth. To confront the shadow is to accept a humbling truth. You are not as good as you imagine, and not as bad as you fear. You are complex, contradictory, human. This realization does not weaken you, it stabilizes you. It removes the fragile mask of perfection and replaces it with something far stronger, authenticity. A person who can say, I am capable of harm, and therefore I choose restraint, is far less dangerous than one who insists, I am only good. The first is conscious. The second is asleep, and it is always the sleeping psyche that causes the most destruction, because it does not know what moves it. Making peace with your own darkness does not mean surrendering to it. It means bringing it into the light of awareness, where it can no longer operate unseen. When the shadow is integrated, it becomes a source of strength rather than sabotage. Energy once spent on denial is freed for creativity, responsibility, and meaningful action. If the world feels fractured, violent, and unjust, it is because countless individuals are at war with themselves. Societies are reflections of inner states magnified. Every unacknowledged shadow adds weight to the collective burden. But every individual who takes responsibility for his own darkness removes a small portion of that weight. The task is not easy. It requires courage greater than any external battle. It demands honesty without self-deception and humility without collapse. Yet this inner work is the most effective way to reduce harm in the world. Not by pretending to be better than others, but by becoming more conscious than you were before. When you make peace with your own shadow, it no longer needs to announce itself through cruelty, judgment, or destruction. It becomes integrated, contained, and transformed, and in that quiet inner victory, the world becomes, in a small but meaningful way, less dangerous, because you have chosen to know yourself. There is a deep comfort in believing that life happens to us rather than through us. It allows us to explain our suffering without having to transform it. We point to circumstances, to fate, to the failures of parents, systems, partners, or society, and for a moment the burden feels lighter. The psyche rests in this explanation because it removes responsibility. Yet what brings comfort rarely brings growth. Comfort preserves the familiar, even when the familiar is painful. Growth, on the other hand, demands that something in us must change, and change is always unsettling. At a certain stage of psychological development, blaming the world becomes no longer sustainable. What once felt protective begins to feel imprisoning. The stories we tell about why we cannot move forward slowly become the walls of our inner life. Maturity announces itself not with confidence or certainty, but with a quiet, often frightening realization: if my life is to be different, I must respond differently. This realization is not accompanied by blame or self-hatred. It is not a moral attack on the self. It is ownership, and ownership is profoundly empowering. To take responsibility does not mean declaring yourself the cause of every wound you have suffered. Much of what happens to us is beyond our control. We are shaped by families we did not choose, cultures we were born into, and events that arrived without warning or consent. Responsibility does not deny these realities. It simply states that while we may not control what happens, we are responsible for how we meet it. The moment a person says, "This is my life, and I am responsible for how I respond to it," a shift occurs in the psyche. The world does not suddenly become easier, but the individual becomes stronger. Victimhood is a psychological state, not merely a description of suffering. When it takes hold, it convinces the individual that all power lies outside himself. In this state, energy drains away, initiative weakens, hope becomes dependent on rescue. The person waits, sometimes for years, for circumstances to change, for people to apologize, for fate to be kinder. Yet life rarely responds to waiting. It responds to engagement. Agency emerges the moment responsibility is accepted. Agency is not the belief that one can control everything, but the recognition that one's actions, attitudes, and choices matter. Psychological research repeatedly confirms this truth. Individuals who experience themselves as active participants in their lives, rather than passive recipients of events, demonstrate greater resilience, stronger mental health, and a deeper sense of meaning. They bend rather than break under pressure, because they see themselves as contributors to their own destiny. Imagine two individuals facing the same loss, the same rejection, the same failure. Outwardly, their circumstances are nearly identical. Inwardly, however, they inhabit entirely different worlds. One asks, "Why is this happening to me?" This question, though understandable, subtly reinforces helplessness. It positions life as an adversary and the self as a target. The other asks, "What is this asking of me?" This question does not deny pain, but it invites participation. It assumes that meaning can be drawn from suffering, and that growth may be demanded by it. The difference between these two questions is the difference between stagnation and development. The first keeps the psyche locked in complaint. The second opens the door to transformation. When suffering is met with responsibility, it becomes a teacher rather than a jailer. The pain remains, but it no longer defines the individual's identity. Many people fear responsibility because they confuse it with guilt. They believe that to take ownership of their lives is to condemn themselves for everything that has gone wrong. But responsibility is not an accusation. Guilt says, "I am bad." Responsibility says, "I can act." The first paralyzes, the second mobilizes. Consider how often people say they feel trapped. Trapped in relationships, careers, patterns, or emotional states. Often, what traps them is not the situation itself, but the belief that they have no role in shaping their response to it. Once responsibility is accepted, even the smallest choice becomes significant. A conversation can be approached differently. A boundary can be drawn. A habit can be examined. These small acts accumulate, and over time, they alter the direction of a life. Responsibility also brings dignity. To take oneself seriously enough to act is to affirm one's own worth. Waiting to be saved, while tempting, subtly erodes self-respect. It suggests that one is incapable of movement without external intervention. Responsibility, even when heavy, restores a sense of inner authority. The individual no longer asks for permission to grow. This inner shift has consequences beyond the individual. A society is shaped by the psychological stance of its members. When responsibility is avoided, blame multiplies. Groups fracture, conflicts intensify, and dialogue collapses into accusation. But when individuals take responsibility for their own reactions, emotions, and choices, something stabilizing occurs. They become less reactive, less defensive, less inclined to project their inner chaos onto others. This quiet maturity does more to improve the world than loud declarations ever could. Taking responsibility is not a single decision. It is a daily practice. It shows up in how one speaks when angry, how one acts when afraid, and how one responds when disappointed. It appears in the refusal to hand over one's inner life to resentment. It is present when a person says, "I may not like this, but I will not let it define me." There is a profound strength in accepting that no one is coming to rescue you from yourself. At first, this realization feels lonely, but soon it becomes liberating. You discover that the same force you were waiting for has been within you all along. Responsibility reconnects you to that force. A better world is not built by people who feel powerless. It is built by individuals who have accepted the weight of their own lives and chosen to carry it consciously. Not with bitterness, not with pride, quietly, daily, consistently. In doing so, they transform not only themselves, but the invisible psychological foundation upon which the world rests. Most people believe that change begins with speech. They believe that if they can find the right words, the right arguments, the right slogans, the world will listen and transform. Words are seductive because they give the illusion of action without demanding inner change. They allow us to feel morally active while remaining psychologically untouched. Yet words, when separated from life, lose their power. They become noise. The psyche listens not to what is proclaimed, but to what is lived. From the earliest moments of life, human beings learn not through instruction but through observation. A child watches far more than he listens. He absorbs the emotional atmosphere of a household long before he understands language. He learns what love is by how conflict is handled, what honesty is by what is hidden, what courage is by what is avoided. No lecture can override a lived contradiction. If a parent speaks of patience but lives in irritation, the child learns impatience. If a teacher speaks of integrity but cuts corners, the lesson is hypocrisy. The unconscious always believes behavior over belief. This principle does not end in childhood. Adults are no different, though they like to believe they are. We are constantly reading one another at levels far deeper than conscious awareness. Tone, posture, consistency, and emotional congruence speak louder than carefully chosen phrases. A person who lives truthfully does not need to persuade others. His presence persuades for him. There is a quiet authority that emerges when words and actions are aligned, and people respond to it instinctively. Societies often imagine that they are shaped by ideas alone. They rally around slogans, ideologies, and declarations of values. Yet history shows that these symbols only gain force when they are embodied by individuals willing to live them at personal cost. A slogan repeated without embodiment becomes hollow. A value preached without sacrifice becomes propaganda. Real transformation occurs when ordinary people begin to behave in extraordinary ways, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Consider honesty. It is easy to praise honesty as a virtue, and just as easy to betray it in small, convenient ways. The minor lie told to avoid discomfort, the truth withheld to maintain advantage. The exaggeration used to appear more impressive. These acts seem insignificant, yet they shape the moral atmosphere of relationships and institutions. When honesty is compromised in small ways, dishonesty becomes acceptable in larger ones. The individual who speaks passionately about truth but lives casually with deception teaches others that truth is optional. The same is true of kindness. Many claim to value compassion, yet practice contempt in private. They are polite in public and cruel in subtle ways, through sarcasm, dismissal, or indifference. This contradiction does not go unnoticed. It teaches that kindness is a performance rather than a principle. Over time, such performances erode trust and normalize emotional violence. Cruelty does not always arrive as aggression. Often it enters quietly, disguised as superiority. Fairness follows the same pattern. It is often demanded from others while quietly abandoned in oneself. People protest injustice while justifying their own selfishness. They demand accountability while avoiding responsibility. This dissonance weakens the moral fabric of any community. Justice cannot survive as an abstract demand. It must be lived in daily choices, especially when no one is watching. Truth, then, is not a statement. It is a state of being. It is not what you argue for, but what you are willing to become. To live truthfully is to allow your inner values to shape your outer actions, even when it is inconvenient, costly, or uncomfortable. This alignment is rare because it requires sacrifice. It demands that you relinquish the safety of appearances and accept the vulnerability of authenticity. There are countless examples of individuals whose influence far exceeded their position or power because they lived what they believed. Teachers who changed the trajectory of entire generations not through extraordinary intelligence, but through consistency and integrity. They showed up prepared. They treated students with respect. They admitted mistakes. In doing so, they taught responsibility more effectively than any curriculum ever could. Long after the lessons were forgotten, the example remained. Parents, too, shape lives not through perfection, but through accountability. A parent who can say, "I was wrong," offers a child something invaluable, permission to be human without being dishonest. Such moments build resilience, not weakness. They teach that strength lies not in never failing, but in facing failure without denial. Children raised in such environments learn to trust reality rather than defend illusions. Leaders who are remembered are rarely those who spoke the most or promised the most. They are those whose character remained intact under pressure. Power reveals what was already present. When authority amplifies integrity, trust grows. When it amplifies contradiction, damage spreads quickly. People may obey power, but they follow character. And character is not announced. It is revealed over time. Living truthfully has a contagious quality. When someone refuses to participate in deception, it creates discomfort at first. It exposes the quiet compromises others have made. But over time, it also creates safety. It signals that honesty will not be punished, that accountability will not be exploited. In such environments, others begin to relax their defenses. They begin to tell the truth themselves. This is how culture changes, not through force, but through permission. When one person lives with integrity, he gives others silent permission to do the same. No argument is required. The example does the work. This permission spreads slowly, almost invisibly, but it is remarkably durable. Trends fade. Slogans expire. Embodied values endure. Living truthfully is not dramatic. It is often quiet, repetitive, and unnoticed. It shows up in returning what you could easily keep, in speaking honestly when silence would be safer, in treating people with respect when no reward is offered. These acts rarely attract applause, yet they shape the psychological environment in which others live. There is also a personal cost to living this way. When words and actions align, self-deception becomes impossible. You are forced to confront your own inconsistencies. You cannot hide behind ideals while betraying them in practice. This confrontation can be uncomfortable, even painful, but it produces coherence, and coherence produces inner peace. Much of human anxiety arises not from external pressure, but from internal contradiction. When you live the truth you want others to follow, you stop demanding change and start embodying it. You no longer wait for the world to become better before you act better. You understand that the world you experience is shaped, in part, by the standards you tolerate within yourself. This realization restores a sense of meaning to even the smallest actions. Culture is not an abstract force. It is the accumulation of countless individual behaviors repeated over time. Every embodied value strengthens it. Every lived contradiction weakens it. When enough individuals choose integrity over convenience, honesty over appearance, responsibility over blame, the culture shifts, not overnight, not dramatically, but irreversibly. In this way, the most effective way to influence the world is also the most demanding, to become what you wish to see reflected back to you. Not perfectly, but sincerely. Not loudly, but consistently. Truth does not require applause. It requires embodiment. And when it is embodied, it speaks more clearly than words ever could. We live in a time that treats comfort as the highest good. Pain is quickly numbed, whether through distraction, medication, entertainment, or denial. Struggle is viewed as an error in the system rather than a natural condition of being human. Discomfort is interpreted as failure, as evidence that something has gone wrong. From an early age, we are taught to avoid suffering at all costs, to move away from it as quickly as possible, to hide it, suppress it, or escape it. Yet this flight from suffering carries a hidden cost. What is avoided does not disappear, it merely changes its form. Suffering is not an accident of life. It is woven into the structure of existence. Loss, disappointment, limitation, and pain arrive not because we are weak or unlucky, but because we are alive. To imagine a meaningful life without suffering is to imagine a life without depth. The psyche does not mature through comfort alone. It matures through confrontation. And suffering, when faced consciously, becomes one of the most powerful forces for psychological development. There is a growing body of psychological research showing that individuals who engage deeply and honestly with hardship often emerge with greater empathy, clearer values, and a stronger sense of purpose. This phenomenon is sometimes described as growth following trauma, but the growth is not automatic. The decisive factor is not the suffering itself, but the manner in which it is met. The crucial word is consciousness. Pain that is understood transforms. Pain that is avoided hardens. When suffering is denied or numbed, it does not resolve itself. It sinks into the unconscious, where it continues to shape behavior from below the surface. It becomes bitterness, cynicism, resentment, and quiet hostility toward life. The individual may appear functional, even successful, yet carry an invisible weight that distorts perception and relationships. Unprocessed suffering narrows the soul. It closes the heart. It turns life into a negotiation with disappointment. When suffering is faced, however, something different occurs. Facing does not mean glorifying pain or seeking it unnecessarily. It means allowing oneself to feel what is painful without immediately escaping it, explaining it away, or turning it into blame. It means asking what the suffering reveals rather than why it should not exist. In this way, pain becomes meaningful, and meaning is what allows the psyche to endure. Every wound carries information. It tells a story about vulnerability, limits, attachment, and loss. It reveals what mattered enough to hurt. When we listen carefully, suffering exposes illusions we have lived under, false identities, unrealistic expectations, unexamined dependencies. It strips away what is no longer sustainable. This stripping is frightening because it feels like disintegration. But often, it is the beginning of reorganization at a deeper level. Every hardship asks a question, though rarely in words. The question is not, "Why has this happened?" Who must you become to carry this? This question shifts the focus from injustice to transformation. It does not deny the unfairness of pain, but it refuses to let unfairness have the final word. It places the burden not on explanation, but on development. A person who has never suffered deeply often remains psychologically shallow, not because of moral failure, but because the deeper layers of the psyche have never been activated. Suffering forces attention inward. It demands reflection. It interrupts automatic living. In this interruption, there is an opportunity to discover resources that would otherwise remain dormant: patience, humility, compassion, and inner strength. Those who transform suffering into wisdom tend to develop a particular quality of presence. They listen differently. They judge less quickly. They recognize pain in others without needing it to be announced. Their empathy is not theoretical, it is lived. They do not offer empty reassurance or simplistic advice. Instead, they offer understanding, which is far rarer and far more healing. In contrast, those who escape suffering often become rigid. They cling to comfort and certainty, and when life inevitably disrupts these, they respond with anger or despair. Their avoidance leaves them ill-prepared for reality. They may appear strong on the surface, but they fracture under pressure. What was never integrated cannot support growth. Pain also has a way of breaking down the false separation between self and others. When you suffer, you discover that vulnerability is not a personal defect, but a shared human condition. This realization dissolves arrogance and softens judgment. It allows you to meet others not from superiority, but from recognition. In this sense, suffering can become a bridge, connecting individuals through shared fragility, rather than isolating them through comparison. Many of the people who have contributed most meaningfully to the world did not do so despite their suffering, but through it. Their pain refined their perception. It clarified what mattered and what did not. It stripped away trivial concerns and revealed essential values. Their insight was purchased at a cost, and that cost gave it weight. Wisdom that has not been tested by suffering often lacks substance. The temptation to escape pain is understandable. Suffering disorients. It challenges identity. It confronts us with our limits, yet escape often leads to repetition. What is avoided returns, sometimes in more destructive forms. Patterns repeat because their underlying meaning has not been grasped. The psyche insists on being heard, and it will speak through symptoms if it is ignored. To integrate suffering is to allow it to reshape you without allowing it to poison you. This integration requires time, honesty, and often solitude. It may involve grief, anger, confusion, and fear. These emotions are not signs of failure. They are signs that something real is happening. Integration is not about quick recovery, but about deep understanding. When suffering is integrated, it becomes a source of strength rather than shame. The individual no longer needs to hide wounds or pretend they do not exist. The wound becomes part of the story, not the end of it. In many cases, it becomes the very place from which meaning flows outward into the world. A society that refuses to acknowledge suffering becomes superficial and cruel. It demands constant positivity and interprets pain as weakness. In such a culture, individuals suffer alone, believing something is wrong with them for feeling what is inevitable. But when suffering is acknowledged as formative, it restores dignity to the human experience. It allows individuals to speak honestly about pain without fear of exclusion. Your pain, when understood, does not have to separate you from others. It can connect you. It can deepen your capacity to love without illusion, to act without arrogance, and to live without denial. Suffering does not make life smaller unless it is refused. When faced consciously, it expands the soul. Those who make the world better are rarely those who lived untouched lives. They are those who allowed life to touch them deeply without closing their hearts. They did not escape suffering, they listened to it. And in listening, they discovered not only who they were, but who they could become. Many people are undone not by a lack of ideals, but by the distance between their ideals and their actions. They dream in large images and speak in grand language. They want to heal the world, correct injustice, restore meaning, and bring peace where there is conflict. Yet when the moment comes to act, they hesitate. The task feels overwhelming. The vision is so vast that it paralyzes movement. In aiming too high, they act too little, and the gap between intention and reality quietly widens. There is a hidden danger in grand ambition. It can become a refuge from responsibility rather than an expression of it. To focus on changing the world allows one to avoid the far more uncomfortable task of changing oneself. It is easier to speak of justice than to practice honesty when a lie would be convenient. It is easier to demand peace than to confront the inner chaos that spills into daily interactions. The psyche often prefers abstraction because it does not require immediate sacrifice. True transformation does not begin with heroic gestures or dramatic declarations. It begins in the smallest, least visible corners of life. It begins where resistance is felt most acutely, within habits, reactions, and choices that appear insignificant but are repeated every day. These repetitions shape character, and character shapes destiny. What is practiced becomes automatic. What is automatic becomes fate. Consider how often people wait for the right moment to begin. They tell themselves they will act once conditions improve, once clarity arrives, once confidence is established. But confidence is not the cause of action, it is the result of it. Waiting reinforces passivity. Action, even imperfect action, generates momentum. The psyche responds to movement, not intention. When you act, you signal to yourself that change is possible. Starting small is not a compromise. It is a strategy grounded in psychological reality. Large changes overwhelm the nervous system and provoke resistance. Small actions, however, bypass this resistance. They are manageable, concrete, and immediately verifiable. Telling the truth in one difficult conversation may seem minor, but it reorganizes the inner world. It aligns thought, emotion, and behavior. This alignment produces a sense of integrity that no external validation can provide. Taking responsibility for one neglected duty has similar power. Neglect corrodes self-respect. Each avoided responsibility quietly reinforces the belief that you cannot be trusted with your own life. When you choose to act, even in a small way, you reverse this process. You restore trust between yourself and your conscience. Over time, this trust becomes the foundation of confidence. Showing compassion in a moment where cruelty would be easier is another small act with profound consequences. Cruelty often arises not from malice, but from fatigue, fear, or unresolved pain. Compassion interrupts this pattern. It requires awareness and effort, and in doing so, it strengthens self-control. It also alters the emotional climate around you. One compassionate act can soften hostility, de-escalate conflict, and open the possibility of connection. History does not move forward through speeches alone. Speeches may inspire, but they do not sustain. What sustains is behavior repeated over time. Cultural shifts are the result of countless individual actions, quietly performed, often unnoticed. When honesty becomes habitual, trust grows. When responsibility becomes routine, stability emerges. When compassion becomes consistent, communities change. The psyche is shaped not by what we admire, but by what we do. Ideals that remain unacted upon slowly lose their vitality. They become sources of guilt rather than inspiration. Small actions, however, breathe life into ideals. They make values tangible. They transform abstract principles into lived realities. There is also humility in starting small. It acknowledges limitation without surrendering purpose. It recognizes that no single individual can fix the world, but each individual can influence the part of the world he inhabits. This recognition prevents despair. It grounds hope in action rather than fantasy. A single candle does not eliminate the darkness of a room, yet it changes the nature of that darkness. It introduces contrast. It proves that the darkness is not absolute. The presence of light, however small, alters perception. Shadows recede, shapes become visible, direction becomes possible. In the same way, a single disciplined action introduces order into chaos. Light spreads not because it is aggressive, but because it is visible. When one person acts with integrity, others notice. They may not comment, but they register it. Over time, such actions accumulate. They create an environment in which better behavior becomes more likely. This is how norms shift, not through enforcement, but through example. Many people underestimate the power of consistency. They believe that only dramatic change matters. Yet consistency compounds. A small act performed daily outweighs a grand gesture performed once. Habits form the backbone of character, and character shapes the future more reliably than inspiration ever could. Starting now is crucial. Delay is often disguised as preparation, but it frequently masks fear. The longer action is postponed, the more formidable it appears. Beginning breaks this illusion. The first step is rarely elegant or complete, but it is decisive. It moves the psyche from contemplation to engagement. There is also a moral dimension to starting now. Every moment presents an opportunity to act in alignment with your values. When these opportunities are consistently ignored, a subtle self-betrayal occurs. Over time, this erodes meaning. Acting, even in small ways, restores it. Meaning arises from participation, not observation. The desire to make a difference is deeply human. It reflects an instinct toward contribution and belonging. But this desire must be grounded in reality to bear fruit. Reality responds to action. It does not respond to wishes, complaints, or ideals alone. When action is aligned with values, even on a small scale, it generates a sense of purpose that sustains effort. The world is not changed all at once. It is changed incrementally, through countless acts of courage, honesty, and responsibility. These acts rarely appear in history books, yet they form the invisible foundation upon which visible change rests. Each small act is a vote for the kind of world you wish to inhabit. To start small is to respect the structure of the psyche. To start now is to respect the urgency of life. Time does not wait for readiness. It responds to engagement. When you take a step, however modest, you align yourself with the forces of growth rather than stagnation. Light does not ask permission to spread. It simply shines. When you choose one small, conscious act today, you introduce light into your own life. From there, it moves outward, quietly, persistently, altering the darkness not by force, but by presence. If you want to make the world a better place, do not ask where evil lives. Ask where responsibility is avoided. Ask where truth is compromised. Ask where the shadow is denied. Then begin there within yourself, because when one person becomes more conscious, more honest, more integrated, the world becomes slightly less chaotic. And when many do this, civilizations change. The world does not need more perfect people. It needs aware ones. Start with yourself. That is how it actually begins.